1 in 5 Gen Zs report not having a conversation with anyone over 50 in the workplace last year.
I saw that
and
one,
then the flip of that was worse, which it said something like 40% of people over 55 said they hadn't talked to a Gen Z in the workplace in the last year. So I was stunned. I thought, well, there it is. We're not talking to each other. And so there's such an opportunity, I think, to just acknowledge that we're there, that this has happened, and all of these dynamics have led us to that spot, and to say, let's normalize that every generation has something to teach and has something to learn, and let's like proactively set up those opportunities for that to happen.
Welcome to It Gets Late Early. Today I have Professor Megan Gerhardt with me. She is the author of Gentelligence. She's a professor at Miami University in Ohio, and she's been studying this for a while. And so what she's going to deliver to us today is an understanding of why generations at work matter and what sort of things we can learn from having, 5 generations in the workplace now, right? 5?
That is correct. 5.
Yeah. So welcome to the show, Megan. So happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So I think first and foremost, let's kick off. What is Gentelligence and why does it matter?
Gentelligence is the idea that we need to be smarter about the multi-generational workforce that we're all in today, that we need to push back from these lazy stereotypes and cliches and clickbait, and instead recognize we have this wonderful rich potential of, as you said, a 5-generation workplace that we are largely wasting by judging other generations, by making assumptions, by not getting curious about the ways that people see things different than the way we see them, for really fascinating ways, and just digging into that complexity as a source of diversity of thought and using that to help us do intergenerational learning and collaboration versus competition, frustration, all those things we might think of right now that go along with generational differences.
So at this point in time, my understanding is that it's only 8% of organizations out there that actually pull age into the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging sort of equation. Why do you think that is?
It's fascinating. That's the latest stat we have. I feel like that data probably needs to be updated. We need to redo the study, so I'll put that on my list. But it's fascinating. It's part of what drew me to this field, is that we've worked really hard on how to manage different kinds of diversity well in the workplace. And even though age is a very obvious one, we all are very aware of age and generational differences, it has not really made it into the list of things that our DE&I professionals maybe are exploring very much, or even when we're thinking about ways to leverage difference productively, we seem to have passed over age and generation. So one of our reviewers of the book, he called it the missing link in this conversation, which I think is very true. And whenever I speak or I do workshops, I always say, let's think of this as a type of cultural diversity. It's a cross-cultural difference. And I don't think people consider it that way. And I don't think I've had anyone disagree with me, but yet the idea hasn't occurred to most of us. So I love that. That means there's a lot of opportunity here to just add it into the conversation and see what we can do.
Yeah, I would agree. I think age is a huge part of our culture, and you just have to look online to see this. I mean, there are just constant floods of memes and different sort of relatable content about being of a specific generation or of a certain age, and also the stage of life that you're in, right? But there's also a lot of vitriol. There's a lot of vicious commentary out there. There's a lot of intergenerational warfare that really is mind-boggling to me. Like, I went onto Instagram the other day and I saw this post. It was a humorous attempt at a post, but the comments were unbelievable. They were just like, screw the boomers. They don't understand anything. It's all their fault. They got us in this situation, et cetera. And then you had the boomers responding with, oh, you entitled lazy people, et cetera. And it was like, wow, how did we get here? And so I know that the idea of even labeling generations in and of itself is a bit of a hot topic, because there's a lot of clickbait, if it bleeds, it leads. That's a reality in news. And so if it's something that's going to capture your attention, people are going to use it. And those labels sometimes get there. But clearly, with the title of your book and your methodology being Gentelligence, it seems you see a place for these generational labels. So I'd love to hear your take on some of the intergenerational warfare and the purpose of having these generational labels.
Absolutely. I do think they're important. And every year or two, we see some very well-written work come out saying we need to get rid of generations. We need to get rid of the generational labels. They're doing more harm than good. And whenever I read those, really what they're saying is we need to get rid of generational stereotypes, which I 100% agree with.
Yeah.
But I don't think that means we get rid of the concept of generational identity. And the reason for me is it's very similar to if we were talking about race and we said that people should be colorblind, which early on was sort of the proposed solution to bias and prejudice. And being colorblind is certainly preferred to the stereotypes and the prejudice and the discrimination, but it misses then the unique story of people's lived experience. And so to
100%.
me, you're throwing out something that is important. What we're getting wrong isn't that we've tried to organize people by similar age groups or time in history in which you were born and started your career. That is human nature. That's social construction. So, you could say the same thing about political parties. Are political parties productive? Usually not, but they are an organizing framework we use because as humans, we tend to need those to make sense of things. And so I think where we went wrong was the way we're using them. And so I talk a lot in my work about generation as a layer of identity, which I think is really, really important. So I believe generations matter, but they certainly are not everything. They are the beginning of the conversation to me, not the end of the conversation. So I don't know who you are if you tell me the year you're born. That's horoscope. That's not social science. But it's a clue a little bit about how maybe your workplace norms or the way you're thinking about a concept might differ from mine from some really valid sources. The context matters. And so I think you lose that when people say, well, we're perennials, or let's just stop talking about generation. That's just realistically not going to happen. And so to me, the place that we need to focus is how we think about generations. And instead of this bizarre permission we seem to have given each other to name call and, patronize people based on the year they were born or the generation that they're part of, we need to have smarter intergenerational conversations. The fact that my 18-year-old is doing things differently than I did at 18 is quite logical. That there's a lot of things that are different in his world than the world I was starting out in that long ago. And the judgment that it's wrong because it's not how I did it or would have done it is silly. And so I think when you say it's the stuff of memes, I have bad generational headlines embedded into my talks, my presentations. My wall in my office at work has magazine covers about generations. And I like to use those to prove the point that you're saying. We seem to, if it was race or gender or anything else in those kinds of headlines, people would be horrified.
Oh, yeah.
We would call the publications and insist that someone, be fired. But we're so used to seeing that clickbait, and it's just feeding this completely unproductive narrative.
So how do we move from unproductive narrative in society to getting this front and center in our workplaces and having this conversation in a way where we can actually be productive?
Yeah, I'm working on that. That's a great question.
Doing great work, I would add.
Thank you. Yes. We need strategy. And I think, I found so many statistics where you can find whatever percentage of managers saying, this is really important. This is an issue. People are coming to me about this. So many statistics showing that we know it matters. And then equally as many low statistics showing we have no idea what to do. So we know it matters. We don't have a strategy, and we are where we are. And this is not a new problem, right? We have, we found quotes in our book that range back to BC of people saying, like, what is wrong with kids these days? Like, they are irresponsible. They do not know how to work hard. We are all in trouble. It's human. It happens with every new generation in the workplace. There are similarities in the narrative, and then there are also differences. But we still don't have a strategy. So we keep running into the same issues. So I think to answer your question, we have to give people tools. And the tools have to be realistic. They have to be things that people can practically put into use in a real job. So everybody can't stop everything they're doing and completely revamp their approach to intergenerational dynamics. It has to be something I can launch in an all hands meeting, or I can try it when I'm doing a one-on-one and see if it works better. And then next time I'll do it again. So that's what I've really been focusing on the last couple of years, is what are those practical tools that professionals can see themselves using with the goal of having a more productive and smarter intergenerational conversation. And that means, instead of this judgment that, why won't these kids blank, or these young people, or even on the flip side, because this is a two-way street, like, okay, boomer, like instead of that, how can we focus on realizing that if this is well managed and this is well led and people feel valued for their unique point of view and perspective, then we're going to get to the potential and the opportunity. Imagine having any other kind of talent potential right in front of you, like 6 decades of experience, expertise, different kinds of knowledge, different ways of thinking, and just wasting it completely and saying, well, I don't know, that seems hard. That's what we're doing. And so I think it has to be small wins around. As somebody who practices Gentelligence every day, I work with Gen Z undergraduates daily basis. You only have to experience the power of it once or twice to get hungry for more. A number of times I say, can you come in here, because I want to wrap some different heads around this problem. And we come up with this amazing solution that's not my way or their way, but like we figured it out collectively. That's very addictive. So I think it's those small wins, those strategies, those tools, the things that I've been trying to work on through Gentelligence. I offer a set of what I call power questions. So if I want you to have a smarter intergenerational conversation, what are some questions you could use to back out of something that's tense and is heading in the wrong direction and try to restart it in a more productive way?
Love that. And when it comes to actually bringing these conversations into the fold at organizations, to whom are you bringing this information? Are people coming to you and actively seeking this out? Because I'm wondering, what's the best approach here? I mean, is it someone who's a rank and file employee noticing, hey, we have all these people in the workforce, but we're not really pairing off. We don't have mentorship programs. We don't have an ERG supporting people of different ages, right? Is it best for that person to have this conversation? Is it maybe something that's more falling on the HR or talent side of the equation, or is it the C-suite? Just curious what you've seen and what's been most effective.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of reach out. It has been a really unexpected second career for me, particularly the Harvard Business Review article. So in 2022, we were lucky. Harvard Business Review featured Gentelligence as its big idea piece. So that's run quarterly. And so it was, a labor of love for sure, but the platform of Harvard Business Review cannot be debated. And so it was called Harnessing the Power of Age Diversity. And they were such great partners in helping us boldly put out there that there is a power in this that we're not seeing and appreciating. And the organizations that do are going to be much more successful and competitive. So before that, the inquiries in the business was definitely steady, and now it's just wild, which
That's
I love.
awesome.
I love opening my inbox because I have no idea who's coming, and it's been from, tech, and we've seen people from, I've talked to the United Nations, I've talked to the Department of Defense, I've talked to healthcare, a lot in healthcare, finance, education, you name it. It's professional sports. It's everyone who's having this challenge in similar ways, but then every industry is unique. I did a talk at a family business conference last week. So imagine the intergenerational challenges in a family business.
Add family, like real family, not fake family at work family.
No, real family.
Yeah.
And so definitely they're reaching out. And then if I do my job well, the word of mouth has spread. So in terms of where that reach out is coming from, I would say most of it starts with someone in my field, which means either learning and development, HR, diversity and inclusion, the people who are probably hearing first the frustrations people are having, whether it's HR hearing, people coming and saying, I'm just going to give you a couple examples. So women coming to HR and saying, my boss keeps calling us girls. That's not appropriate. And it's like, well, that's partially a generational thing. What are we going to do about that? Or these young people, don't understand blank, or why are we losing all of our Gen Z talent? Or it can be any range of things we're hearing. I mean, that's my favorite part, is that it surfaces differently. Challenges around mental health. So Gen Z being very open about mental health challenges and having amazingly broken down that stigma for the first time ever, but going into work incredible. And sharing with their boss, who is of a different generation, that they're having mental health struggles. And then that person probably was told, you don't talk about that at work. And now someone's talking to me about it at work, and I don't know what to do with that. Am I allowed to still ask them to get their work done? Am I supposed to just let them do what they need to do? And so real challenges like that I just find so fascinating, because you're dealing with, it all comes down to norms. So that's why I don't like stereotypes. I'm not interested in putting people in a box. I get questions from the media a lot. How does Gen Z want to communicate? It's like, well, that's millions of people. I don't have an answer to that question. You can ask them. You should start having that conversation. I'm sure you'd find differences and similarities. But what I'm interested in is, what are the norms that develop around the way you do things, how you define success, what career means, just all of these things, depending on when you start your life and your job, and what do you learn success looks like, and how do you then carry that into the workplace? And so, I feel like there's so much to discuss there, and norms are something you can track through data. You can look at those and go, oh, that norm spiked for this generation. We had never seen that before. Instead of insisting everybody in that generation did that, which of course is ridiculous, but they probably knew somebody who did, right? And that's such a great way to walk that line between appreciating and respecting the story of a generation without insisting everyone had the same experience.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that reframe of norms, and that being sort of an underpinning for people rather than a stereotype that we can use to just completely blast an entire generation of millions of people. So that's really a critically important thing. And, I'm curious, what drove you to this work? Because you clearly have a very keen interest in it. You've been working on it for quite some time now, and you have established yourself as really one of the foremost experts in this arena. So tell me a little bit about what drove you to study this.
Definitely. So I would say I've been actively working in the space for 15 years, but the story of why I'm so passionate about it begins 20 years ago. So I started my career as a professor at my current university when I was 26. So I began the semester being closer in age to most of my students than I was to most of my colleagues. So that was very interesting, and just naturally found myself talking with my students a lot about their points of view, trying to figure out if the way they were looking at things was different than how I was looking at them, and then comparing that and both of those things to how my older colleagues were viewing whatever topics we were talking about, what was going on in the world. And it was no intentional strategy at all. It just was a very unique place to be in. And sure. I learned so much. And after the first year or two, I thought, wow, being open to learning from my students in a way that was not defensive, it was just very curious. And then, of course, learning from my older colleagues, my mentors in that direction, all the things they had experienced and the things about the organization and best practices made me so much better at my job. And I thought, well, this is fantastic, because every generation is represented. Every company has this kind of difference and this kind of diversity. So I wonder how other professionals are learning from this. And my background's in organizational psychology, organizational behavior. So anything about human behavior at work, I'm so interested in that. And so just started doing both research and speaking and consulting with companies. and found this was the time our millennials had just entered the workplace. And I found people were not enjoying it at all. They were just really frustrated on both sides, that there was a lot of, wires getting crossed and entitlement accusations, and just clearly something had hit a fever pitch. And so I wanted to understand why I could have had such a positive experience with something that seemed to really be frustrating for most people. And as I continued to dig into it, and the more audiences I spoke with, so many things surfacing where we just were talking past each other, and there was a lot of almost threat on both sides. Like, I don't trust your motives. I don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. If you're valuable to this organization, does that mean I'm not valuable? Who gets to have that opportunity or that information? And I thought, this is not what you do with your talent. This is so unproductive. And then, as you said, the more you dig into it, organizations aren't putting this on their DE&I list. We're not looking at this as a valuable kind of difference. Why is that? And so that led to the book, which I co-wrote with two millennials who are former students of mine. So that's important. You gotta use that generational diversity to write about generational diversity. And then just led to everything else. And now it is what I do. It is who I am.
So you clearly saw the value of younger and older people in your work as a new professor. But what I find to be interesting is that you were on the younger side, right? You were a younger professor. And in the tech industry, there seem to be quite a few young people and fewer older people. There seems to be an ageism against the older individuals. And I would think of academia as perhaps being a little bit reverse ageist. Like, did you feel any of that ageism yourself as a newer professor?
It was really interesting. I think I was experiencing some of it maybe in those, I love thinking about like age-based microaggressions. I got a lot of, you're not possibly old enough to be a professor, which is one of those passive aggressive things where it sounds like you're being complimented, but then later you're like, what does that mean? So, you look like a student. I used to get that multiple times a week. I would show up to support students at like awards or things, and they'd be like, so, what year are you? And it was flattering in a way, of course, because we associate youth with, oh, they think I look so young.
Well, we're women too, and we're told that's what we should be chasing. That fantasy,
exactly. So, but I mean, there were certain times where it was very irritating. I was in the faculty lounge, and the older faculty member stuck his head in and said, this is the faculty lounge. And I said, yes, that's actually why I'm sitting here, because I'm great. And so I think, there were certainly times where I knew walking in a room that, especially when I was doing speaking, the mean age was maybe late 60s, early 70s of executives. And I think you have to think differently in that scenario, which I wrote a lot about in the book, that you're not going to win on that by insisting, that you have more experience and more. You have to think about, who are these people? What are they worried about? What problems do they have? And how do I help them? I think I learned really early on that being defensive or trying to prove that I was old enough or had the experience was just a losing game. I like to have my work just speak for itself. But I had a really interesting moment, maybe you'll find entertaining. So pretty early on, I was in a faculty meeting, and we had just hired, or I guess interviewed, a bunch of candidates for a visiting position. And we found someone who was spectacular. He was great. And I remember one of my older faculty colleagues said, I just wish he looked older. And I did this double take, and I was like, what did you say? He said, I just wish he looked older. And I said, why? I couldn't even figure out why you would say that. And he said, I just don't think students will respect him. He looks like he's 16 years old. Wow. So I'm sort of doing a personal inventory at the time of did they have this conversation about me? But I said, I don't think our students very well. I can't imagine any of our students base credibility assessments on how old someone looks, because they themselves feel like they know a lot of things they don't get credit for. I think that is an outdated way of looking at it. So I actually did a research project based on that conversation. When we assess credibility, what are we looking at? And does that vary by generation? And the short conclusion was yes, that we all care about someone's character. We all try to assess, are you an expert? Like, do you seem to know what you're talking about? But the one thing that was significantly different for younger generations was, does this person know how to connect with me? And connection and the importance of it was called sociability, but the items were really about, they take time to explain to me why this matters. They make sure that my perspective on this lines up with the way they're thinking about, like, and I thought that's so fascinating. And that's because these are generations that don't need us for information. They can get information from anywhere in 5 seconds. It's really context and why should I care about this? And can you help me make sense of this? And how does this, factor into what we're looking at right this second? And is this good information? Like, that's the role that we need to play. And that doesn't have a lot to do with age. It has to do with how well somebody is willing to, connect with you. And that's what made all the difference. So I felt it, but I think I've always just been a person who feels like their age can maybe speak for itself. And I've always actually found it to be more of an opportunity, almost like I'm a bridge. I'm a Gen Xer. So in general, we're sort of a bridge generation. We're a sandwich generation. And I've always felt like I was a bridge between students and maybe my older colleagues, although now I am one of the older colleagues. So I'm not sure where that leaves me right now. But yeah, that's kind of been my experience with it.
So now that you are on the older side, do you feel ageism just either at work or in society in general?
I have not felt that yet. So I'm 47. I just, maybe in the last few years, students started referring to me as like, you're just like, it's like having a great mom. Like, I take students abroad and I'm like, oh, am I mom now? I'm mommy. I used to be like cool aunt, like maybe like awesome quick. Big sister. But I have colleagues where I hear the students say like, she's like the grandma you wish you had. So that hasn't happened yet. I haven't. I mean, just really honestly, I think, as you said, academia is a place where we have a very wide range. At 47, a lot of people don't really even start their careers in academia maybe till their 30s. So I've been there 20 years. I have at least, I think I counted 14 until I've been there long enough for my pension to kick in. I don't know if I don't think I'll be desperate to leave, but I'm still kind of in the middle. So I haven't fortunately felt that ageism yet. I think the students keep me very young, which I am grateful for. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, and I also feel like being discounted and feeling as though you have to overcome something that gives you sort of the underdog mentality that can be really advantageous in the end. So I think starting out as such a young professor, you probably had that fire under you to some degree. And I'm sure at some level it's probably helped you.
I choose to, there were early years or early days when I thought, oh, how does a professor act? I should be very authoritative. I should be very rigid. Like, they will not respect me otherwise. And as you would imagine, that didn't work very well. So I think just being authentically myself has always been my default. I felt like, here's somebody who can understand their point of view. It might not be my point of view, but I can understand it. And I can maybe even translate. For example, we saw about the time I started my career, a lot of young people were really demonstrating a new norm. For us, it was sort of coming in to argue about my grade, but then that translated in the workplace to, coming in to push back on policy or things like that, which we hadn't seen from young people very much prior to the millennials. It was sort of like, well, I don't understand that policy, but I guess I have to just accept it and wait until I'm the one who can change it. I don't really have that power. And the millennials didn't get that memo. They grew up with a really strong sense of voice, being the center of a lot of resources and investment in their needs and their interests. And they brought that voice with them, which made absolute sense. And so I once talked to my students and said, if you were unhappy with an exam or a grade and you felt it was unfair or, something had gone wrong, what would you do? And the sentiment was largely I would come in and sort of debate or negotiate or argue or discuss, depending on the person. And I understood why they were saying that. They're under a lot of pressure, just like Gen Z, a lot of competition. They feel a strong pressure to excel. And I said, well, here's the thing is I understand where you're coming from. I understand why you have this strong voice and, I'm proud of you for using it. But I never would have gone to my faculty and done that. That just wasn't a norm that we had. And I didn't go to school that long ago. And the guy down the hall from me who's 70 probably called his professor sir and wasn't allowed to speak in class. Like, the norm has changed. And I asked them, I said, what percentage of your parents do you think would have had that response to not liking a policy? And they guessed 90%. And I thought, oh, they don't know. They think people have always pushed back or always,
right.
And they said, well, I would have thought you'd want to know that this was, confusing and I said, but traditionally, no, like unless you have the degree or you have the title, like you don't get to have an opinion about it. And they didn't agree with that. So it really isn't right or wrong. It's different. But I said the guy down the hall is not going to think that's logical and totally makes sense. He's going to tell you not to hit the door, have the door hit you on the way out. That's going to look really entitled to him.
Totally.
And you need to know your audience. You need to think about it. So, I do think it's an opportunity in that I felt like I could maybe do a little bit of mediating and translating.
I love that. And, one thing that I definitely want to get into is the concept of mentorship. And, especially post-pandemic, when we think about the workplace norms and white collar work in particular, there's a lot of remote work happening, right? And so when I think back to my own career and the fact that I was in the office most of the time up until maybe 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to foster intergenerational friendship by virtue of just being in person, right? And what Adobe actually recently put a study out there, and they asked Gen Z if they wanted a mentor, and a whopping 83% of people said that, yes, I do want a mentor, and only 52% of those people actually had one. So this is something that Gen Z is craving. What do you see for the types of opportunities that are in play for Gen Z and connection with older colleagues to help with that sort of a transition and help into the corporate fold?
Yeah, so much to dig into there. I think first and foremost, you hit on something at the beginning that I don't want to miss, which is that we focused a lot on, obviously during lockdown, but then post-pandemic on productivity with hybrid remote work. Can we be as productive working at home? And for most jobs, the answer was, yeah, we think we can. So what's possible? One of the things we missed in that conversation that we're now experiencing the consequence of is that productivity is only part of the equation. There are things around, workplace outcomes like engagement and organizational commitment and loyalty and identification and all of those things that are very hard to accomplish in a hybrid remote environment. They're not impossible, but they're hard. And if you mix in generation and life stage, the people who need those things the most are our youngest workers because they're just starting. They're trying to figure out what's it mean to be a professional? What's it mean to be part of this industry? What does it mean to be part of this company? And as you said, being in that space, watching what other people do, picking up on the norms, grabbing coffee with a coworker, pop in your boss's, office to ask a quick question, that builds understanding of who this place is. And my identity is as part of this organization. That's not happening behind a computer in an office, isolated from everyone else I work with. And so many of my young graduates, so maybe they've been out a year or 2 years, will call and say, I think I'm going to leave. I just don't feel connected to this place. It's been 18 months. I've never met my team in person, or I've never been to, my office, or if I go in, there's 3 people there and none of them are in my cohort. And we're trying to figure that out as we speak. But Gallup released data this week saying engagement's at an 11-year low, and it's the lowest for hybrid, remote, and young employees, which is not a surprise at all, given all those things. So if we then go to mentorship, the fact that Adobe found that many Gen Zs were hungry for a mentor flies right in the face, or right in opposition to the stereotype we have that young people aren't interested in learning from older people. I did a panel last year, and it was an online audience, and the chat was on fire. And I just happened to look over, and there was a comment in the chat that said, I'm 67 years old. I have so much to teach, but I don't think any of these young people are interested in learning from me. And I think that is the perception. And so what I think we're missing there is that young people do not want to lecture. And I hear a lot, like, I respect that person, I know I could learn from them, but when they talk to me, it's a lecture. It's a one-way, information sort of session that seems to ignore the context of what my reality is. Like, that isn't relevant anymore for me. Or if it is, I need help seeing how I could use that now, given what I'm facing. And so I think we think younger people don't want to learn or don't respect. And I think it's more, we're not talking to each other. And I did a piece for HBR a couple weeks ago talking about intergenerational friendships at work. And one of the things I talked about was almost every organization has age polarization. So we enter a company with people around our age that graduate school the same time as us at the same career level, and then we progress relatively on the same schedule. And it's sort of rare to work on something meaningful with somebody substantially older or younger than you. And that means we don't really have an opportunity to replace stereotypes or tropes with, oh, I work with this amazing baby boomer who has like the greatest insights on these things. I'm probably not exposed to that. And we're not talking to each other. So there was more data that came out from, it was LinkedIn and Fortune 2 weeks ago, that said 1 in 5 Gen Zs report not having a conversation with anyone over 50 in the workplace last year.
I saw that
and
one,
then
yeah.
The flip of that was worse, which it said something like 40% of people over 55 said they hadn't talked to a Gen Z in the workplace in the last year. So I was stunned. I thought, well, there it is. We're not talking to each other. And so there's such an opportunity, I think, to just acknowledge that we're there, that this has happened, and all of these dynamics have led us to that spot, and to say, let's normalize that every generation has something to teach and has something to learn, and let's like proactively set up those opportunities for that to happen.
I love that idea. And I imagine that's part of the work that you do within companies. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the practical application and some of the outcomes of your work at these companies across all industries.
Yes. So we love the concept of mutual mentoring. So when we were writing the book, we were talking about mentoring and reverse mentoring, and we kept going back and forth. Everybody knows what both of those things are. It was actually our editor who said, I just feel like the phrase reverse mentoring is not Gentelligent. It sounds like it's backwards to learn something from someone younger than you, which of course was brilliant. She was absolutely right. So we went with mutual mentoring, and I think there's a number of ways to do it. I have experienced time and time again, this idea of like a structured mentor program is like very difficult to have work. We've tried this at the university where we have all these very generous professionals willing to spend time with students, but we pair everybody up and then it's like nothing happens. And so I think
because it's about that connection, right? You have to have the connection, and you can't manufacture that. It's either there or it's not.
So
yeah.
You can't be like, I have been assigned this person and I find them inspirational and I want advice from them. Like, rarely do those things both happen. And so it does have to be kind of organic. And so I think in terms of how we set this up for companies, I think there's a couple different ways. I think the more proactive opportunities we make for people of other generations to spend time together, meaningful time, whether it's on work, whether it's on committees, whether it's an intergenerational resource groups are a thing that I've seen as a number of my clients who started with the millennial resource group, the Gen X resource group, and quickly learned, well, that's not super productive to have a bunch of people from the same generation talking about how they're not being appreciated for how important they are.
Little echo chambers.
Exactly. So these intergenerational resource groups are fantastic because everybody in there goes in believing there's something to learn. So I think that's a great place to start. And then even if we don't quite have the one-on-one partnership down, I love the idea of taking a topic that we really suspect we're talking about in different ways or in different directions, and specifically inviting and asking people to represent their point of view from a generational lens, not speak for all the Gen Zs or whatever it would be, but where are we missing some important generational context? So tomorrow, for example, I'm having a lunch and learn that I'm hosting where we're talking about the challenges of hybrid and remote work at different career stages. And so
Awesome.
I'm asking the professionals to share with students where they've seen this remote hybrid workplace be fantastic. Like, what have we learned? What do they love about it? How have they benefited? Where have they seen it be difficult? And then what I'm really interested in is our students being able to share their concerns. Because we have this stereotype that young people all want to work totally remote. I don't know. We think they're going to be like in a van in Bali, like digital nomad, the whole thing up. And what I've seen the opposite. So I've had so many students who have a hybrid offer, in-person offer that suddenly gets moved totally remote, and they're crushed. They want to, they don't want the job because they want to be a professional. They want to get in that office. They want to, have that identity. 100%. They don't want to work alone in their bedroom, and and that's not what they're interested in. And so that's an opportunity for them to speak about what their concerns are, what they wish, what they hope.
Yeah.
And then you get this two-way conversation. And I'm hopeful that what comes from that is that as people listen in that larger group, we start seeing connections of people who really hit it off in terms of having things to say to each other and really engaging. I think that's really, really important. And I also think from a company standpoint, an opportunity, if you want to try to do something a little more structured, is I've seen these wonderful, I don't call them databases, but asking people, what's something you would love to learn how to do? Whether it's work related or not, it depends on the purpose of the exercise you're doing. And then what's something that you would love to teach someone else? And
That's
making
brilliant.
some initial pairings where I don't know how old the person is who can teach me SEO or how to close 100%. A deal or whatever it is, but inviting people to both learn and teach, and then seeing where that goes, I think is a pretty easy place to start.
I think that's a great idea. And I can think of one such example in my past career too, where I had a need to launch a campaign really quickly. And my older colleague at the time, I was 30 or something, and my colleague was in his 50s, and he whipped up this bespoke little campaign headquarters online within like an hour, and it was beautiful. And I was like, I have no idea how to do that. Like, not a clue at all. And you would think that would be something that would be maybe more traditionally in my wheelhouse as the younger person who's super tech savvy and all of those stereotypes, right? But in fact, it was he who had all of those capabilities. And so I was able to see right away, wow, look at what this guy is capable of. And it was very helpful for me. So if there are project-based type of opportunities like that, where you can see and showcase skills of people across the organization, you will see disparate types of people and different types of generations that have those skills. And that's just kind of a very natural way of it unfolding. And then you can kind of make a case study out of it, right? So I think that's a really, really great, proper application that's going to yield a lot of benefits for people. It's super cool.
Yeah,
it's really awesome.
Sure.
In your work, have you seen any specific aha moments that you want to share with the audience of this sort of clicking for people like, oh, we should care about this. We should actually facilitate these connections between the generations?
Yeah, I think I'll share two. So one's a story and one is maybe the part of my work that I'm most proud of that I think is the biggest light bulb. So the first, I'll share the story. So this is a story when I first started speaking, I was doing a talk for a healthcare organization. It was their emergency medicine department. And we did all of the talk about the power of generations and how we need to look at this differently. And this woman stood up. She told us she was a baby boomer. And this is a very simple story, but whenever I tell it, I feel the clicks happening. So she stood up and she said, this all sounds great. Like, I don't disagree, But here's my problem, right? Which is we're all like, what does this look like for me when I go back to work? How am I going to make this happen? So she said, my problem is these young people. So I always say that's capitalized. Like whatever's coming next is like a loaded phrase, just like boomers, right? So
yeah,
like,
not good.
anytime you hear like the boomers, you know there's something loaded after that. So these young people are coming in the exam room with my nurses and doctors, taking out their phones, not paying attention. And it's unbelievably rude. And the tension and the anger and the judgment in this like statement was so powerful. And I thought, oh, I've heard this in different shapes and sizes so many times. And so we have these practices in Gentelligence. So they are, as I said, just things you can do every day a little bit different than till it becomes kind of a second nature. And one of them is identifying assumptions. And so I just asked her colleagues, because I thought she'll hear it from them. She might not hear it from me. And I said, so what assumption did you hear being made in that? Because that's a very real scenario. The phone was out. Can't argue what assumption was being made. Well, they're not paying attention. Said, okay, so some of them aren't. Like, we'll just punt that there's some percentage that are very, very rude and just aren't paying attention. But what judgment was made because of that? So our second practice is adjusting the lens, which is basically be curious, not judgmental. So what judgment immediately occurred when the phone came out? You know, that they were being rude, not paying attention, rude. So I said, can we adjust the lens? Like, is there another, if we step back and we enter into this from a different direction, is there another interpretation of this that might be true? And her colleagues across generations, not just younger people, said, well, I take notes on my phone. Or maybe I'm looking up what time the pharmacy closed, or I'm texting my roommate that I have strep throat and she should probably get tested, or I have no idea what that woman just said. I'm going to Google it so I don't sound like an idiot when I'm asking my questions. You know, this long list. Voice recording was one I heard recently. Like, I'm tired. I don't feel good. I want to make sure I don't mess up these instructions. So as they shared different interpretations, it was the first time I saw someone's lens shift, like it nudged.
Wow. That must have been so cool.
All this like emotional energy being mad.
Yeah.
And she's a very smart woman. I'm sure she absolutely knew the phone had all of those capabilities, but that's not how she uses her phone. She didn't grow up and start her work and her career with the phone as a work tool. So the way she uses it might be to talk to her family and friends, or perhaps check her email, but she would never take it out with a doctor in the room. And so it was almost like this signal to her about everything that was wrong with kids today.
Yeah, kids these days.
And so I love that, because you can substitute whatever triggers your like generational angst, right? Yep. You're seeing it through your lens. So that would be one. And then the second thing, which is the finding or the insight that I'm most proud of, that I think is the biggest aha for people, is I see myself, another one of my in-between roles is I try really hard to translate research and scholarship to industry for people who want to use it but don't want to go digging in all these, really obscure journals where things are made very hard to understand to begin with. And so I want to interpret that. I want everything I do to be research informed, but also really practical. And so if you look at the academic literature on generations, it's kind of messy and muddy. And for the most part, a lot of the research will say, this is much ado about nothing. There's not as much here as you might think. Generations all seem to be relatively the same at work. But then you ask someone who's in there living it and they're like, you want to bet? Like, come to work, something is going on. So how do we make sense of that? And my insight there is that if we look at what people need at work, we find a very common set of things that are true whether you're 17 or 77 or anywhere in between, which is we all have a need for respect. We all have a need for connection. We have a need for autonomy. Competence is sometimes put in there. They have slightly different names depending on the research, but in general, everybody needs that. So if we stop there, which a lot of academic studies do, we say, see, everybody's the same. Stop complaining about it. It's fine. But then the part we miss is that although those internal needs are the same, the generational norms we've learned on how you fill those needs or the appropriate way to pursue those needs or what works can look very different. So for example, my dad is 75 and he's a proud baby boomer, and he ran a law practice. And he said, when I started my career, the way you got respect is you put your head down, you closed your mouth, and you did your time, right? Yep. You waited for somebody to come tell you it was time for your promotion because you paid your dues. Mm-hmm. And when I retired, these young people were coming to me and telling me it was time for their promotion or they wanted a raise, and I don't get that. And I thought, exactly, they want the same thing you wanted. They want respect. Mm-hmm. They want to be seen as competent. What they learned, and I'm suspecting these were millennials, but what they learned was that if you want to get ahead and you want people to notice you and you want to, be seen as respected and competent, you get to the front of the line and you raise your hand because somebody else is going to do it if you don't. Like, waiting for somebody to tap you is not a success strategy that the millennials learned was going to work. And so the need is the same, the norm is different. And what we're doing is we're judging the norms. We're saying, well, you can't do it that way, or I never got to do that, or why is it okay for you to say that, want that, ask for that? I never got it. And then we're talking past each other. And so that for me, I think has been a big insight to bring to help people understand when you start judging the norm, you need to peel it back and look instead at what's sitting underneath it.
100%. I think we are so much more alike than we are different, and we just have different routes of getting to what we need. So I love that whole story. And I also, it's funny when you were talking about the woman who had these preconceptions and misconceptions about what people were doing on their phones in the operating room. I mean, I actually think through that when I'm in a room of people, proverbially or otherwise, and I have my phone and I need it for whatever work reason, I proactively say, I preempt it and I say, hey, just so you know, I'm not being rude. I'm actually taking notes on my phone right now. Just that sort of thing. So if you see me glancing down, I'm not texting my friend, I'm listening intently and I am actually capturing what you're saying right now. So, I mean, we can think about it in that way, right? We can actually have the perspective of, okay, well, what will others possibly think based on, right? So it's having that sort of frame of mind and recognizing that other people might interpret your actions in a different way, depending on who they are in any number of ways of being, right? And any number of sort of factors. So.
Yeah, I love that because that's, such a great strategy and tool. So one of the power questions I mentioned earlier is, can you help me understand? Which is not rocket science. But imagine, right, you have your phone out at a meeting and somebody else might say, like, can you help me understand why all the phones are out or the laptops are out or whatever it is? It's better than put those damn things away. But you preempting it and being aware enough that you having your phone out might raise eyebrows to somebody who wouldn't ever have their phone in a meeting, and saying, like, just want to let everybody know I'm taking notes on my phone.
Heads up.
We had that. We were in the hospital with my dad and we hadn't slept, and his surgeon came in and my sister, I remember, voice recorded the instructions, the like at home instructions. And my dad reached over and sort of like, whacked her on the knee and said, put your phone away when the doctor's in here. That's so rude. And my sister said, I was recording what your doctor said so we don't screw up your care when we get home. I'm exhausted.
This is for you, Dad.
Right. But it's a great example of someone's going to see that through a different lens and they're going to draw conclusions. So if you don't want that to happen, either asking permission, would it bother anyone if I recorded this because blank? Or on the flip side, if no one's offering an explanation, asking so that you understand. And then maybe the last thing to say on that is, it doesn't mean we have to let people have their phones out or, I've written a lot of stuff in the last couple of months about, transparency and younger generations wanting more context and more explanation and why do we do it this way? And I said, when you're willing to pull back the curtain and explain why I have my phone or why we have this policy or why this is important here, most people, regardless of age, will appreciate the explanation, the respect of somebody, bringing them up to speed. And then maybe it is either just accepted at face value or we can have a discussion. I think where we fall into traps is a generation that had all the information they'd ever want at their fingertips, entering into an organization where there's gatekeeping around knowledge or explanation. Like, why do we have to wait 3 years to be promoted here? Because that's how we do it here, is not a satisfactory explanation. No. But saying, well, let me dig into this with you. I'd love to give you some context on what you learn in year 1, year 2, and year 3, and why we think that's very, very important. Can't think of a single Gen Z that would say ridiculous. I disagree. But they would appreciate the explanation. And when I write about things like that, I call it pulling back the curtain. I often will get managers saying, do I really have to do that? Kind of like you saying, do I really have to tell everyone why I'm on the phone? I have the right to be on my phone. And my answer is, you don't have to do anything, but how's it working for you to not? Like, what's your goal
going for you?
And also it becomes a discussion of norms, right? If I say, well, I would prefer you not have your computers out, because in my experience, we have such a better idea exchange if we don't have to worry about screens in between us, then we can decide, well, maybe we'll split the difference. We'll brainstorm, and then we'll pull those computers out to record what we've come up with, whatever the right thing is for what we collectively are trying to accomplish versus the way I want to do it versus you. I think that's where we have to land.
I completely agree. And I think if we can all just peel it back to, let's try to understand one another, and let's have just open, transparent communication about things, and really be curious, then I think we're all going to be a lot better off, because these things will become quite apparent, and it won't be, well, my way or the highway, or this is how it's always been done, or, well, this is the new best technology, why aren't you using it? That sort of miscommunication is just everywhere in the workplace, and it really gets in our way. And I think, what I'm hopeful about is that we see, and perhaps you're already engaging in some of this, but that we see more research about the actual money, the dollars, the cold hard facts about what kind of productivity potential and revenue is lost by virtue of having these miscommunications throughout the workplace and not letting people work together more seamlessly. So, because I know, especially in the tech industry, they're going to really, really care about like what's being lost in terms of the revenue generation. That's what's going to make them move, I think, above all else. So it's corporate, I guess, for you, right? So
absolutely. And there is a cost to it. We know what the daily experience is, but the cost of not having successful knowledge transfer at some point when people leave either to retirement or they're going to work somewhere else, if we're not listening and talking to each other, we're going to lose that. Certainly engagement, team dynamics, turnover being huge, whether that's your youngest, your oldest, or maybe talked about the least, all of us in between. So I know obviously tech skews younger. Tech has had its share of headaches with, age discrimination issues. But what's interesting is sort of thinking about what value are we leaving on the table? And if we aren't providing opportunities, it just comes down to every generation needing to feel like their organization values them, appreciates the unique value they bring, understands their needs, and that their needs might look a little different than people at a different life stage, career stage, age, all of those things that are intertangled. And being open to the fact that there's a pretty good return on that investment. I mean, especially in tech, how expensive it is to replace talent. Like that specific talent at that level costs an unbelievable amount to replace. So let's try to not lose it in the first place. And there's all kinds of, I know we're getting close on time, but one of the things I found really interesting is the biggest stereotype that I'm sure feeds into a lot of this tension in tech is that older people can't use technology, right? That's the elephant in the room. And so when we're hiring and our people strategies are that we're looking for fresh, energetic.
Oh yeah, all that coded language.
Language.
Rockstar.
Yeah, rockstar, exactly, which is probably another podcast. But when we do that,
it is.
That's kind of sitting underneath. And there isn't really any solid research showing that older people are less able to learn the technology.
No.
The research is much more interesting than that. I have a lot of, clients who will say, I've invented the technology. Everybody's positive I don't know how to use. But I think what we actually react to and why we feel like there's something there is lots of research showing that older people become less motivated to learn the newest tech, and they become less interested in it being pervasive in everything that they do. And the reason is that our brains, when we're younger, react to fluid intelligence, which is what's the newest thing, the shiny thing, the newest iPhone update, the newest tech, the newest tool is interesting, right? I want to go try that because maybe it's a little better than the thing I had before, which is why we associate that with innovation. But then as we get older, maybe around my age, the research seems to keep shifting on this, we switch and start relying more heavily on what's called crystallized intelligence. And crystallized intelligence is, what do I already know how to do that can do that thing? It's almost a research source conservation. As our responsibilities expand, it takes time and effort to learn every new thing, and it's often not worth it. And so I'll learn that new, software, or I'll update my iPhone as soon as I'm sure it's worth my time. But right now, my phone works great. The software works totally fine. I'm incredibly productive and successful at it. And when and if I decide I want to look into that, I have every capability to learn. And so it's really motivation and pervasiveness more so than ability that I think is behind that, sort of looming cloud about age and tech.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. But again, that's just really underscoring the necessity of age diversity in our workforce so that we can actually harness the power of both types of brains and, get past all these stereotypes. So I think, the work you're doing is hugely influential, and I'm so excited about seeing it more and more out there in the world, in Harvard Business Review, on the TEDx stage, at South by Southwest. You are everywhere, Megan, and it's fantastic to see. So we all owe you a debt of gratitude for what you're doing out there. How can our listeners go find out more about the work you're doing?
Absolutely. You can visit me at gentelligence.org. So that's my website where you can sign up for insights, things like that, look into training. Of course, on LinkedIn. We also have a remote training platform we're excited about, Gentelligence Academy, where people can kind of learn on their own time and think more about all these topics that we've raised. So yeah, like you said, I'm out there as much as I can be, articles and trying to just kind of give people some food for thought on how we can frame this entire topic in a different and more productive way.
Well, I love it. And I'm so grateful you took the time to be here today. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.